Let's talk to someone who is keeping a very, very close eye on all of this and indeed getting involved where his organisation can. David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, also served as Foreign Secretary, of course, from 2007 to 10, joining us live on the show from New York. David Miliband, thanks so much for coming on the show this afternoon. Could you just give us your assessment as to where you think we are now in terms of the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Because I think it is worth repeating at every opportunity.
Thanks, Lewis, for having me on, and your introduction, which highlighted the danger that this catastrophic situation becomes normalized, is absolutely right to flag. I mean, we're talking about a situation beyond desperate. At least 30,000 dead, including the majority of them women and kids. 25% of the population of 2.2 million likely facing malnutrition. Hard to get figures, but we have an emergency medical team at the Al-Aqsa Hospital at the moment doing orthopedic surgery, but we also support partner organizations around the Gaza Strip trying to tend to health needs, trying to address the most dire malnutrition threats. And of course, pretty much the whole population displaced from their homes. So we're talking about death, destitution, and displacement. This situation faces double jeopardy. One is that there is such threat to life and limb. Remember, there are still the 100 plus hostages that are being held, as well as the 2.2 million Palestinians. But second, this just every day that the death and destruction continues, it makes it harder and harder to foresee an eventual settlement in which these communities are able to live together. And this has big geopolitical consequences. But my concern as the leader of a humanitarian organization is that literally lives are at stake, because at the moment, if the fighting doesn't get you, the danger is that the threat of famine or the threat of public health emergency does get you.
How much worse do you think, if that's possible, how much worse do you think the situation could get if the Rafah offensive, which we've been told could have been imminent for some time, but preparations are clearly still underway, how much worse do you think that it could get if the Rafah offensive goes ahead?
Well, obviously much, much worse. There are two aspects to this. One is that Johns Hopkins University have said that 58,000 more people are at risk because of the public health emergency, even if the fighting doesn't get worse. Then when it comes to the question of how much would Rafah add on top of that, how much would a Rafah offensive add on top of that? What people need to understand is that because of the displacement that I referred to earlier, about 1.92 million people displaced from their homes, they've crowded away from the north of Gaza and the center of Gaza down into the south. Rafah is the city in the southernmost part of the Gaza Strip. It abuts the Sinai Desert. It's at the Egyptian border. And obviously, you've now got over 1 million people in the city of Rafah. So all of those are living in fear today that the offensive isn't just green lighted, which was referred to in your news report or in the headlines, but actually takes place. And obviously I have no information about that, but there's 1 million lives at stake, I think is the right way to understand it.
How do you respond, as the leader of a humanitarian organisation, how do you respond to the Israeli defence and the Israeli government defence of what's happening, which is to say that simply, given the current security concerns, they are doing the very best that they can to minimise civilian casualties, and they claim that they are doing all they can in terms of assisting with humanitarian needs and requirements, but the security needs of Israel comes first, and that's what they're attending to?
Yeah, there are two aspects of an answer to that question which we should take very seriously. The first is that allowing food to flow, allowing aid to flow, allowing aid workers to flow, that's no threat to anyone's security. And at the moment, the aid packages that were going in February were half the level of January. And what was meant to happen is that the aid was increasing in February and March rather than decreasing. So, and that comes down to things, just to give you a bit of granularity, every truck that tries to cross into Rafah, the Rafah crossing, gets inspected. And at the moment, goods that are deemed dual use, in other words, they could be used for military as well as for civilian purposes, get stopped. And all sorts of basic medical supplies are getting stopped just on that basis. So you've got one aspect of an answer to the question, say there's no threat to anyone's security from having basic goods go in, just as there was no threat to anyone's security from water flowing, which was a major issue at the beginning of the conflict. The second part of this is that there is a obviously a massive issue in urban conflict when militant or when combatants are mixed up with civilians. But the responsibilities under international humanitarian law are very clear about the need to protect civilians, because civilians have an absolute right to protection of life and limb, as well as a legal right to aid.
Do you think
And
they
so
are
those
breaking
are
international? Sorry to interrupt though. Do you think they are
those are
breaking international law? The Israeli government.
well, that's something that has to be a legal judgment, not a humanitarian judgment. I can't come to a legal judgment about that. That would involve proper looking, a proper investigation. We've called, just to give you an example of how that becomes practical, a missile hit the guest house that our doctors were using at the beginning of February. Fortunately, no one was killed. 3 people were injured amongst ours there. We've not had a satisfactory explanation of whether that was a stray missile, whether that was a mistargeting, what went wrong, or whether it was a pure accident. And we've called for an independent inspection, because that's the way in which such incidents can be properly inspected. But there are very clear responsibilities on combatants to a conflict to abide by them, and they apply to democratic states and to non-state actors.
Do you think the British government is doing enough right now in terms of humanitarian assistance in Gaza?
No one's doing enough. I mean, there's more aid waiting to get through the Rafah crossing than will be delivered through a port that is now being built over the next 30 to 60 days than it could ever get through the port. And none of us are doing enough. I know there's a lot of frustration in the UK system, as well as in the American system, about the bureaucracy, the impediments, the politics that's getting in the way of aid. But none of us can say that the current situation is satisfactory, where the amount of aid is actually going down rather than going up.
I've interviewed Israel, so I'd like you to, in a way, respond to the thing that when I've interviewed Israeli government spokespeople, they always say this. When I say to them, you're not letting enough aid through, they say, well, we're letting as much aid as we can, but when we send aid through, it's stolen by Hamas, and we're not going to help Hamas. What's your response to that?
Well, I can speak very, very clearly to this, because we're delivering aid, and we have very, very clear mechanisms for making sure that it's vulnerable civilians who receive the aid and that it's not diverted. And so we can go through in granular detail about the people who are being treated and why they need it.
So are they misleading people when they say that? Do you think?
Well, I
that's
don't know
simply wrong?
What evidence. What I would say is, what's the evidence? Because what we know is that the aid that we deliver is going to people in desperate need. There are pregnant women in shelters in the north of Gaza who have no support, even in the 8th or 9th month of pregnancy. We have emergency medical team doctors who've come out of hospital saying, I'm the last person holding the hand of a dying person, and I had no saline to put on their lips. So let's be absolutely clear about the severity of the crisis that exists, and how 2.2 million completely innocent people are being afflicted by this. So I would say, let's see the evidence. I just want to make one other point.
Sure.
Remember, if you're worried about the dispersal of aid, dropping it from an aircraft is the least effective way of ensuring that the aid goes to people who need it. Use the World Food Programme, use the International Rescue Committee, my organization, use other organizations to organize the delivery of aid. I also want to make this point. We tried to use the one pause that has existed in this conflict, which was at the beginning of November. We tried to use that to deliver aid. And we got a very clear indication of how little was achieved because of the impediments, because of the difficulties of getting aid in. And it's because of that we've said, because of the legal obligation that exists to protect life and the legal right that civilians have to get aid, to receive aid, that only a ceasefire is going to be able to deliver on that humanitarian imperative. Now, I know there's a lot of politics around a ceasefire, but from a humanitarian point of view, the ultimate fulfillment of the humanitarian imperative requires the fighting to stop.
With your ex-Foreign Secretary, Houghton, David, you probably will have seen what Chuck Schumer has said about Benjamin Netanyahu and what the president appears to have given endorsement to. Would you agree with that assessment, that he is a problem in terms of achieving a peace settlement right now?
Well, it's a long speech by Chuck Schumer, which bears a lot of repeating. Much as I am tempted to put on an old hat, I have to keep my current hat on. And
just for a second.
My current hat requires me to be neutral and impartial, especially in situations when there is a lot of politics involved, and there is here. So I have to not very adroitly
But
and
you're
not very
dissatisfied. But
subtly,
you
not
are.
very subtly sort of evade your question. But I'm not going to say one government has to go, another government has to stay, one government can help, another government
You're
can't help.
unhappy with it. You are
Compromise the
unhappy
work
though.
that we're doing.
But you are unhappy with what the Israeli government have been doing in terms of allowing aid in and their actions at the border and so on at the crossings. You are unhappy with the disposition and attitude
I'm
they've
arguing
taken.
very, very strongly that Israel has an obligation to do much, much, much more to allow the aid to flow to the people who desperately need it.
How
That
can we make them
we
do
have,
so?
Sorry?
How can the West? How can we get them to do so? Because they've shown no proclivity, particularly to do so far. So how does the West? How do we do that?
Look, I've been on the other end as an ally of the United States. This is with my old hat on. When the US wants something from an ally, it can put the squeeze on, right? There are different ways that they put the squeeze on. And America is a critical player in this. There are other players too, because of course Hamas didn't agree to the ceasefire either. So you've got a lot of different players in this. But this is an international emergency. You know that the reverberations of this conflict are going global. You know, from Berlin to Jakarta, people are protesting about this conflict. And my humanitarian concern is about people dying. My geopolitical concern is that every day that more people die, and remember, that's 80 one day, 100 the next day, 120 the next day. Every day that happens, every day of bloodshed makes it harder and harder to see how you get a long-term settlement.
David Miliband there, President CEO of the International Rescue Committee, served as Foreign Secretary from 2007 to 10, giving us his assessment about the humanitarian situation there, which I completely agree. We have got to stop the idea of this becoming normalised, this sort of steady drumbeat of despair and death and despond which comes out of Gaza day by day. Whatever the politics of it, it is grim beyond belief. And everybody, whatever their politics and view on this, can surely agree on that. So we have to find a way.